Welcome to another edition of George Washington Speaks. I'm your host, Tom Saffold. In this edition of George Washington Speaks, we'll follow how the ownership of Mount Vernon went from Lawrence to his daughter, Sarah, to his wife, Anne Fairfax, and then to George. We will also briefly visit his relationship with two other Fairfaxes, George William and Brian Fairfax.
When I was 6, my father, Augustine, recalled my half-brother Lawrence from the Appleby School of England and set him up in the family's little Huntington Creek tobacco plantation. This allowed my father to move my mother and us children to the Ferry Farm, which was closer to his iron ore mining business. When Lawrence reached his majority age of 21 a year later, he began buying up parcels of land from the adjoining properties, starting with acreage around the gristmill on Dogue Creek. My father died 4 years later, and at age 25, Lawrence, as his oldest son, received the majority of his estate, which included Little Hunting Creek. He soon renamed the plantation Mount Vernon in honor of his former commander, British Vice Admiral Edward Vernon. 7 years later, at age 32, Lawrence knew he was going to die soon from tuberculosis. Since he had no male child to carry on the Washington name, Lawrence made sure that his wife, Anne Fairfax, would be able to stay at Mount Vernon, or if she moved, that she could lease it for the income for as long as she lived. This was important, since the law did not allow women to own property. He also provided that Mount Vernon should pass to their young daughter Sarah after her death. However, if she, Sarah, should die without children, it was to become the property of his half-brother, George, that is, me. Unfortunately, Sarah did die before Lawrence's will was even settled. Anne was soon remarried to George Lee, a close family friend, and she moved from Mount Vernon. A year and a half later, I leased Mount Vernon from Anne for 15,000 pounds of tobacco or 100 pounds cash. When Anne died 7 years later, I came into full ownership of the plantation. At the same time, George William Fairfax, my lifelong friend, inherited the Belvoir estate after his father died during the early years of the French and Indian War. 2 years later, after I married Martha, we moved to Mount Vernon, and George William and his wife Sally frequently hosted us at Belvoir. 14 years later, George William and Sally left for England to pursue a complicated inheritance lawsuit. They left me with a power of attorney to oversee their interests in Virginia, which I did until 2 years later when I was appointed to command the Continental Army in 1775. They were ardent loyalists, and they never returned to America. 12 years later, George Williams did die at his home near Bath, England. Martha and I invited Sally to come and live with us at Mount Vernon, but she elected to stay in England. George Williams' younger brother, Brian, was 4 years younger than I and also a lifelong friend of mine. We were together on the surveying trip into the wild western lands of Virginia, and we shared the adventures that were both frightening and thrilling to us at age 16 and 12. During the early years of the Revolution, he traveled to New York in order to go to England and use his considerable influence and connections on both sides of the conflict to act as a mediator. However, he was arrested in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, for refusing to sign an oath of loyalty to the Patriot cause. He wrote a note to me asking for a pass so that he could travel between the lines, which I did. But once in New York, The British officials also desired an oath of loyalty as a prerequisite for him to travel to London. Fairfax again refused, and greatly frustrated, he returned home to Belvoir. He eventually abandoned his plan to travel to New York, and on his way home, he stopped to visit me at Valley Forge. All in all, we wrote more than 200 letters to each other over 40 years, and we proved to be the best of friends.
Thank you for joining us in these 20 videos of Washington's youth. We trust that you've enjoyed getting to know some of the people who influenced Washington and learned about both the difficult and the advantageous situations that he encountered. Such situations confront all of us, and we respond differently. George Washington persisted. He never gave up, not as a youth, not as a general, not as a president. He is an example of what we may become if we persist. In other videos, we find that there were 3 other influencers in his life. They were his family, his country, and his faith. He sought to honor them and serve them over his own personal agenda. Did you know that Martha, his wife, did not want him to serve as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army or as President of the United States? We will explore those stories and others in future videos here at George Washington Speaks.